Defining the concept of locus of control. Internal locus of control is defined as follows. Those who are high on internal locus generally believe that events and outcomes in people's lives are controlled or caused by factors within themselves. On the other hand, in external locus of control, those who are high on this locus generally believe that events and outcomes in people's lives are controlled or caused by factors outside them or external to them. Putting it in the format of contingency, what has been said is that an internal locus of control develops when the past history of reinforcement is filled with contingent rather than incontingent or non-contingent reinforcement, whereas in the case of external locus of control, it is a case of non-contingent rather than contingent reinforcements. Rotter made sure that people understood this distinction between internal and external locus of control not as a typology, but as more like a continuum. Thus, individuals can vary in degree of internality or externality, although they may be dominant on one of these two. Further, it is not appropriate to view internal or external locus as good or bad, that is, to assign a value to either of these two forms of locus of control. Either extreme, that is, being extremely internal or being extremely external in locus of control, can lead to mental health problems. The usual observation is that people differ in internal or external locus of control with regard to domain. So, for example, they may differ in terms of internal or external locus in the academic domain, in the work domain, in family relationships, and also social relationships. Rotter devised a standardized questionnaire to assess internal and external locus of control. Many questionnaires that assess this variable have been developed since the first version of generalized expectancies that Rotter devised in 1966. The later measures of internal external locus of control build in several other dimensions in addition to basically this distinction between internal and external. So, for example, the domain is built into one of the tools so that a distinction can be made between achievement domains as in work and academics and in the affiliation domain as in the case of social relationships. Rotter added another feature of his theory to his elaboration on internal external locus of control or personality and behavior in general. This dimension is referred to as generality or specificity of personality and behavior. Rotter's theory originally proposes generalized concepts, but it does allow for situation specific variations as well. Rotter's ideas generated a huge amount of research. In fact, there is a phase in the history particularly of social psychological and personality research in which locus of control was a very commonly researched or investigated personality variable. But of course, after some years it lost its glow. Internal external locus itself was extended to many different fields. The concept and its measurement were modified in many different ways, as was just pointed out. This idea could also be extended to the causal beliefs in people and how these causal beliefs influence the process of attributing causality in general. So, there are individuals who have a tendency to look at situational information and attribute causes basically to the person concerned, resulting in internal attributions, or they may tend towards making external attributions by finding the responsibility or cause in external or environmental factors. Rotter's theory is classified more as a theory of personality than as a theory of learning. The influence of behavioristic thinking is quite evident in this theory, but the inclusion of social and personality elements makes it very different from other learning theories. What has been the impact of Rotter's theory? It can be said that by including reinforcement as an element, yet highlighting the diverse sources of reinforcement in human behavior, a new dimension or feature was built into existing learning theories. A second form of social learning theory is found in the social cognitive theory proposed by another noted psychologist named Albert Bandura. The basic idea in Bandura's theory is as is being described. Apart from learning in terms of reinforcement or punishment for individual responses or behaviors, learning takes place through social mechanisms as well. And one very major social mechanism in this context is observation of other people. Observational behavior or observational learning involves observing others behaving in specific ways and being rewarded or punished for these behaviors. The observer accordingly learns that certain behaviors should be performed so that they lead to rewards, and certain other forms of behavior should be avoided because they might result in punishment. So, the question is, what is the difference between the commonly known form of behavior called imitation on one hand and observational learning as proposed by Bandura on the other? The answer is that there is an apparent similarity between the two. The similarity, however, is literally only apparent because conceptually the two forms of learning are different. To put the difference briefly, imitation has a biological, or as some psychologists prefer to use the term, an instinctual basis, implying that the tendency to imitate the behavior of others does not have to be learned. Neurophysiologically speaking, more recent research shows that there is something called mirror neurons, and both imitation and observational learning may be activated by these mirror neurons. Further, imitation may or may not be affected by reinforcement or punishment. The repertoire of imitated responses is limited, partly because there is a biological mechanism underlying imitation. As it is usually understood, imitation is found only in a few species of animals. Some examples are monkeys and certain bird species such as parrots, or in India the hill myna. Identification as a mechanism is involved not in imitation, but it certainly is a part of observational learning. Moreover, in imitation, the question of intrinsic factors such as motivation and so on does not arise. Similarly, cognitive factors and identification with the model seem to be missing in imitation. Observational learning involves a more detailed process. It contains most of the characteristics of what we call imitation, but is a form of learning rather than an innate biological tendency. The effects of reinforcement and other environmental variables, along with cognitive mechanisms and processes, is evident in observational learning. The role of reinforcement as consequence in the context of social learning needs a certain amount of discussion. We begin by observing that Bandura redefined the concept of reinforcement as it was generally understood in the context of learning theories. As we have already seen, Skinner's idea of reinforcement was as follows. Individuals learn by making responses themselves, learning from the consequence of their behavior or responses. The consequence could be positive and pleasant, or it could be aversive. According to Bandura, on the other hand, reinforcement makes the individual anticipate outcomes, that is, to expect or look for certain outcomes before they actually come, and ultimately to subsequently behave according to this kind of anticipation. Thus, in Bandura's view, reinforcement may act actually as an antecedent more than a consequence. To reiterate the idea, Skinner's definition of reinforcement was always that of something following a response, that is, coming after a response. Hence, he used the term consequence. Bandura, however, looks at the situation in a slightly different way. Responses, of course, have consequences, but then the sequence of behavior does not stop there. So, the consequence of an earlier response serves as a starting point or as a lesson to learn for future behavior. In this sense, then, whenever the individual who has learned a response to consequence relationship performs that response, that individual also expects a certain kind of outcome. It is this anticipation that was highlighted in Bandura's theory. The conceptualization of reinforcement in Bandura's theory took at least the following two forms: vicarious reinforcement and self-reinforcement. Vicarious reinforcement in Bandura's theory refers to indirect or second-hand reinforcement. That is, the learner observes another person, called the model, being reinforced, indirectly feels reinforced, and thus learns. The same thing can be said about a punishment situation. Why does the learner observe another person and learns through the other person? One explanation or description that was given by Bandura was that the learner or observer identifies with the model, that is, puts himself or herself in the model's place temporarily, and thereby experiences the effects of reinforcement. Self-reinforcement in this theory refers to the fact that the individual gets reinforcement through a comparison between his or her own behavior and his or her own internal standards. If there is a match between the two, the individual experiences satisfaction or self-reinforcement. On the other hand, if there is a lack of match between one's own behavior and internal standards, the individual may experience dissatisfaction, shame, or disappointment with himself or herself. The indication, therefore, would be to change that kind of behavior in future. What is the effect of self-reinforcement? Bandura pointed out that self-reinforcement influences the extent of self-worth felt by the individual, and it provides self-direction in general. Putting it another way, it can be said that based on self-reinforcement experiences, the individual has grounds for evaluating himself or herself in a positive light or in a negative light. Another point that made Bandura's theory noteworthy is the idea of reciprocal determinism. To quote Bandura on this point, the explanation of human behavior in terms of a continuous reciprocal interaction between cognitive, behavioral, and environmental determinants is what sums up the idea called reciprocal determinism. Please note that this is a combination of determinism that was very, very clear in Skinner's view and also in other empiricist views of learning, and free will, for instance, as shown in the humanistic theories and in many self theories. Reciprocal determinism drew attention to the fact that in studying the determinants of behavior in any particular setting, it is important to keep in mind at least these three components, namely cognitive components as they are activated in the individual, behavioral components as they are expressed by the individual, and environmental determinants or variables that surround the individual in that particular setting or situation. A major source of learning, according to Bandura, was observational learning or modeling. 4 sub-processes were pointed out in observational learning. The first one was attentional processes. The second one was retention processes. The third one was called production processes. The fourth one was called motivational processes. A little bit of detail on each of these processes would now be in order. Attentional processes are responsible for initiating the process of observational learning. For example, for the observer selecting one particular model rather than another. This has often been a question raised by several researchers. The second set of processes, called retention processes, include all those cognitive processes, including memory, that deal with handling of model related and situation related information as well as its storage. That is, if in a particular situation the model is seen to perform or express certain behaviors given certain environmental variables, the observer not simply pays attention to this behavior, but also processes and stores all the information that is relevant to this model. The third set of processes, called production processes, include mechanisms that bring about the actual performance of observed behavior. Needless to say, unless whatever is observed and retained is translated into behavior, there would be no external proof that such behavior was ever learned. Motivational processes determine which aspects of the observed behavior will actually be adopted by the observer. In this respect, motivational factors work within the individual, although not isolated from all the other variables that are active in a particular setting. In the case of each sub-process, both model characteristics and observer attributes are mentioned. The general sequence mentioned by Bandura in observational learning is as follows. First, there is the anticipation of a specific outcome or reinforcing stimulus, which activates in the observer. Secondly, attention towards, third, the model, which acts as a stimulus. Observation of this model's behavior leads to, fourth, cognitive processing of the information, which in turn leads to, 5, a specific response or set of responses. What is observed is the first end of this whole process, namely that the observer actually watches or observes a particular model, but the anticipation part and everything else that takes place before the final specific response is hidden and only can be inferred. In addition to these aspects, Bandura points out that in modeling there can be a real model who actively shows specific behavior that is modeled, B, a model who is not actually doing that behavior, but is giving instructions verbally, giving details and explanations for what is to be done in the situation and how. And third, there could be a symbolic model. This model is not actually present at all, but the learner takes the presence of the model symbolically. The model in this case could be literary characters or historical figures who have in some way inspired the learner. So, one example in contemporary Indian society could be as follows. There are individuals who have treated Mahatma Gandhi as a figure worth following or emulating. Of course, Gandhi is not around. So, anyone who observes Gandhi in a symbolic sense is also showing one kind of modeling behavior. Initial research on observational learning of aggressive behavior was in fact the basis for Bandura to point out how the basic tenets of his theory do hold, and this is considered a seminal set of contributions. However, Bandura's theory on learning based on social cognitive factors did not end at this point. He is now known better for his later contribution, which involved the concept called self-efficacy, which is proposed as a learned aspect of personality. Self-efficacy, in Bandura's own words, is the belief in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of action required to manage prospective situations. In common parlance, this is summed up by simply saying that self-efficacy is the sense of I can do it. This concept was proposed as a core component of what Bandura called the self system. The self system itself was analyzed by focusing on three major components: self-observation, judgmental processes, and self-reaction. Further, self-efficacy theory has been developed in great detail. As a belief, self-efficacy has been analyzed in terms of two major components, one that Bandura called efficacy expectations and the other one that he called outcome expectations. What Bandura explained was that the first component involves the individual feeling that he or she can actually perform a particular task. In the second component, there is a belief that on performance of this particular task, specific outcomes will result. There is a probability involved in each of these expectations, which can be measured in specific situations. In the description of the determinants of self-efficacy, the role of modeling in a very extended sense, of self-evaluation and experience, situation specificity, and social factors is clearly but elaborately brought out. Having made a beginning mainly in clinical settings, self-efficacy finds applications in various domains such as clinical, of course, but also organizational and educational settings, as well as health-related areas. In short, the social cognitive theory that Bandura proposed has a clear social learning component that highlights aspects that were proposed also in other learning theories, mainly focusing on the idea of reinforcement, but of course in a modified form. It also has a prominent personality component that brings out the importance of social learning. If we look at the impact of Bandura's theory, one can say that Bandura influenced thinking about the learning process by pointing out that reinforcement-based learning can take place even through observation, and because of this feature, Bandura added a new dimension to contemporary views of learning because existing learning theories did not allow for anything like observational learning. We move now to the third social theory of learning, and that is something that is quite different from the theories that have been discussed so far. Often referred to as social developmental theory or social development theory. This idea was proposed by a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky. It should be mentioned right at the outset that Vygotsky's theory does not at all get the same kind of prominence that is given to Skinner's theory or Pavlov's, Thorndike's or Hull's theory. There could be many other theories that are talked about in the context of learning, but Vygotsky's theory rarely gets mentioned even in textbooks of psychology. The perspective on learning and education that was adopted in Vygotsky's theory brings in an entirely new element in learning theory as a whole. Because this theory has been rarely discussed or described among psychological learning theories, even though it was proposed at the same time as some other extremely well-known theories, not very much is known about certain details of Vygotsky's theory, but more recently, some of Vygotsky's students and supporters have actually looked at his writings and made what can be called a fairly thorough analysis of Vygotsky's views. The core idea in Vygotsky's theory and the point of departure from other learning theories can be summed up below. The process of learning is deeply influenced by cultural, social, and historical factors all taken together. Some scholars have pointed out the need to include the affective or emotional component in learning in Vygotsky's theory. But at the same time, there are others such as Levik in 2008 who have commented that the affective component has actually been built into the theory. Vygotsky died too early to be able to give details of not just the affective component, but some other aspects as well. The social component in this theory is a feature that the theory shares with Rotter's social learning theory and Bandura's social cognitive theory. Yet, the nature of the social component is much broader in Vygotsky's view. Other psychological components, for example, reinforcement and reinforcement history, are not at all part of Vygotsky's theory. Nor is there any emphasis on specific psychological processes such as associative, response, or cognitive learning. This is in contrast to the existing learning theories. Vygotsky proposed that the social component of learning was primary and the individual aspect came only after that. Here is a quotation that makes this idea very clear. Every function in the child's cultural development, says Vygotsky, appears twice, first on the social level and later on the individual level. First between people, that is interpsychological, and then inside the child, that is intrapsychological. That is, learning cannot be assessed merely by examining how well a particular task has been done or is being done. Instead, the social context in which the task is learned should be understood very, very well. The socio-cultural component is emphasized by Vygotsky in a different way, and this way is similar to that found in what is called social constructivism, the idea that individuals make sense or apply meaning to whatever they experience in their own ways. Learning in a child takes place parallel to social experiences. That is, the tools of understanding that the child acquires are necessarily passed on through a social medium, such as adults, for instance parents or other family members or teachers in a school interacting with the child. Providing opportunities for various activities, for stories, games and interaction in general would therefore be effective contexts of educating children. In fact, Vygotsky could not think of any alternative way in which children learn many of the things that come under what we call education. Certain concepts are particularly prominent in Vygotsky's theory. The first one, called the zone of proximal development, often abbreviated as ZPD, is one of these major concepts. According to Vygotsky, this is the phase in learning among children during which they may not be able to perform a task on their own, but can do it with the assistance of an adult. Eventually, however, the same task can be done by the children themselves. During the zone of proximal development, the role of the adult or teacher is very important. The nature and the content of guidance given by these other individuals has an unmistakable effect on subsequent learning by the child. In addition, the child turns to a more knowledgeable other, or MKO, another prominent concept in Vygotsky's theory, for learning, particularly in the zone of proximal development. Constructivist ideas were another part of this theory. Vygotsky's learning theory is said to contain a strong aspect of constructivism, the idea that meaning is created by individuals, including children and adults, while they are learning, and may not exist out there in an objective way, as is often made out to be the case in existing learning theories. One might add at this point that Jerome Bruner, another known cognitive psychologist, allowed for constructivism also. Yet another idea in Vygotsky's theory is called scaffolding, that is, providing temporary props or supports for the learning process at certain phases and removing them later. As is known, scaffolds are provided for construction work, for example, so that workers working at a tall or high place in a building can stand on these scaffolds and complete their work more easily. Once the work is done, these scaffolds are removed. So, by definition, scaffolds are meant to be temporary structures. Likewise, an analogy can be given in terms of the learning process. Adults and teachers interacting with children provide these supports by way of specific interactions or by giving them numerous opportunities involving various cultural aspects, cultural activities or behaviors, so that children learn spontaneously as well as in a formal way. The influence of Jean Piaget's cognitive developmental theory was also clear in Vygotsky's view. Like Vygotsky, Piaget had also emphasized the role of language in learning and thinking. But Vygotsky did not subscribe to Piaget's theory completely. One point of departure between the two developmental theories was as follows. According to Vygotsky, learning guides development. It may not necessarily precede development, because that would be difficult to specify, but unlike what Piaget suggested, that development would guide learning, Vygotsky was very sure that it is learning that leads to, or in a sense guides or directs development. Ultimately, learning and development interact with each other, and these interactive effects are evident in what the child shows as learning. Language plays a crucial role in learning. It is a major vehicle of thought, and therefore, its role should not be surprising. It should also be noted that language has a strong social purpose. Children as well as adults use language as a tool mainly for communication. So, its role in learning becomes crucial because, according to Vygotsky, learning is accomplished largely through social interactions that involve language and communication. A distinction was made by Vygotsky between spontaneous concepts and scientific concepts, and the learning of these two kinds of concepts. Spontaneous concepts are those that children learn because they find them interesting. These are, to use the words of Karpov and Bransford, unsystematic, empirical, and unconscious, but one might add that they occur naturally and are a very important part of the whole learning process. Scientific concepts are those that children learn more formally, for example, in a stipulated classroom situation under a stipulated curriculum. They enable the child to take spontaneous concepts to a higher level. Teaching of scientific concepts requires that those involved in the education system adopt precise and formal procedures, but teaching and learning should be a collaborative venture. A distinction is also made between theoretical and empirical learning, but such a distinction was made more by later supporters of Vygotsky's theory. A fundamental principle in making this distinction is that concepts are learned not only in verbal form and in terms of their application, something that is called empirical learning, but also in terms of their underlying meaning, or what can be called theoretical learning. Let us take a quick look at the impact of Vygotsky's theory. To begin with, it is a less familiar theory and does not fit in easily with mainstream learning theories. Yet, without question, it has influenced the thinking of other contemporary learning and developmental theorists. This theory has many implications for the education process and has made valuable contributions in that direction. It is interesting to note that the theory is still being elaborated as many people are discovering many writings of Vygotsky which did not get any eminence or any attention for a very long time. We've come to the last theory of learning on our list. At best, it can be called a constructivist theory, but it has also been described as a cognitive learning theory. This is the theory proposed by none other than Jerome S. Bruner, who provided a new view of teaching and learning, together taken as education. Bruner was deeply influenced by Vygotsky's thoughts, and he proposed ideas that would modify the education system, possibly something that Vygotsky also had in mind. The basic idea in Bruner's theory is that education, meaning teaching and learning, is meaningful only to the extent that it is sensitive to the influence of culture on individuals, culture being taken in a very broad sense. Here is a quotation from Bruner. What has become increasingly clear is that education is not just about conventional school matters like curriculum or standards or testing. How one conceives of education is a function of how one conceives of culture and its aims, professed and otherwise. In Bruner's view, the process of learning and education should take into account the motives for learning, focusing primarily on arousal of interest, the readiness to learn. Speaking of this developmentally, there are views in Bruner's theory that differ from Piaget's approach to development. The role of thinking, especially focusing on analytical and intuitive thinking, knowing as a process rather than as a product, and the concept of what Bruner calls spiral curriculum. This implies that one looks at what children can do, and based on a general understanding of their achievements and capabilities as well as potential, we go back to the curriculum, redefine it, taking it to a higher level, and so on. And this process should continue throughout various stages in the process of education. Bruner also mentions something called discovery learning and inquiry learning. Both of these terms very clearly connote that students, children as well as adults, should be participants in the learning process. Discovery learning is one in which information or data are provided to students, and they are encouraged to find out new aspects on their own. Inquiry learning, of course, involves discovery, but has a slight difference. Students are encouraged to find out information also on their own, using their own methods, strategies, and sources, and then to discover new aspects. As has already been stated, the aim of both discovery and inquiry learning is to make students participants in the learning process and ultimately to turn out to be autonomous learners, not completely dependent either on teachers or an externally provided education system. In the process of thinking, according to Bruner, cognitive representations can be found to vary at different developmental stages. He makes a distinction between what is called enactive or action-based representations, iconic or image-based representations, and symbolic or language-based representations. Each one is described in some details. Focusing on categorization in thinking, Bruner says, to perceive is to categorize, to conceptualize is to categorize, to learn is to form categories, to make decisions is to categorize. In other words, categorization is of the essence in any context in which thinking is involved, and it is impossible to think of a thinking-free context in any case. Categorization is essential to concept attainment. Various steps have been described in detail once again and have been shown in experiments conducted by Bruner and his associates. These are definition of the task that is involved in categorization, providing examples or exemplars of the concepts that have to be finally attained, validation of these concepts by looking at each example or exemplar, the consequences of specific categorization. There could be many cases in which after initial categorization, the individual is left in a state of puzzle. And finally, the imposed restrictions that make it impossible to extend a particular concept beyond a certain range. The next point is that with reference to language, Bruner agreed with Vygotsky and other scholars that language plays a crucial role in learning by acting as the vehicle for thinking and by being used in learning concepts. Bruner highlighted the role and importance of language through an elaboration of the use and effects of narratives, story-like material which comes out even in conversations, dialogues, and so on. He points out major characteristics of narratives as used by individuals, but we can also include all those who are involved in the teaching process and education. The use of the term scaffolding appears also in Bruner's views, and he agrees with Vygotsky that such temporary props or supports for learning are necessary, particularly when an individual is at the early stages of life. What is the impact of Bruner's theory? First, it is acknowledged as a major contribution. The theory does not deny or disconfirm what many existing learning theories propose, such as the learning of responses based on certain forms of reinforcement, but suggests modifications and adds much more to the existing theories. Bruner's theory has applied value. In the context of education particularly, through emphasizing the designing of curriculum based on varied considerations, Bruner has pointed attention to the necessity for making our curriculum not just student oriented, but making them more autonomous or independent in their thinking. Thirdly, it broadens ideas related to the cognitive aspects of learning, especially with reference to concept formation and the use of different kinds of intelligence. We have discussed several theories of learning, and it is now time to take a look at examples of how certain skills can be taught to children and sometimes adults. Here we have an example of a teacher teaching violin to a young schoolboy.
तो हम लोग राग यमन जो मध्य लय की एक गत उसमें आपको सिखा रहे हैं। तो एक चीज़ ये ध्यान रखना है कि स्पीड बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं बढ़नी चाहिए शुरू में ही, नहीं तो क्या होगा, जो फाइन नोट्स हैं या फाइन जो काम है वो नहीं हो पाता है। तो पहली लाइन बजा रहे हैं। इसको पहले तुम बजा। इसमें क्या है कि आई एम यूजिंग द कर्ण स्वर ऑल्सो। कहाँ पर, ये नी की जगह पर, तो वहाँ पर आप एक कर्ण स्वर देंगे जैसे, तो ऐसा करिए। धनी ध प म प म ध प म ग। पूरी लाइन सुनो, पहले पूरी लाइन। प ग प धनी ध प म ध प म ग। तो ध को धनी ध ऐसा कर, प ग प ग प धनी ध प म ध प म। दिस ध प should be in one bow. प ग प, हाँ, सा नि ध प रे, नी ध प, नी ध प रे, ग म प, सा नि नी द पा रे ग म प। अब इसमें नी की जगह सा नी द पा रे ग म प सा नी द द पा रे ग म प ग रे ग प ग रे।
Next, we take a look at how a different musical instrument is being taught to a schoolgirl.
So, we are playing Rag Khamaj. So, the bandish is like that. Ni sa ni da ma ma pa da ga ma ga. Ma ga sa ga ma ma pa da ni sa। हाँ, वहाँ पे गैप नहीं होगा। ग म म प ध नि सा। सा नि रे सा नि ध द म प। सा नि ध प ग म ग। अब इसमें एक छोटा सा तान करेंगे। नि सा नि ध म म प ध ग म सा ग म प प म ग म ग रे सा सा ग म प प म ग म ग रे सा। उसमें लगाइए नि सा नि ध म म प ध ग म सा ग म नि ध म म प ध ग म ग म प सा नि ध प ग म प सा नि ध प म ग रे सा ग म प सा नि ध प म ग रे सा ग म प सा नि ध प। इसको उसी जगह पर लगाइए नि सा नि सा। हाँ ऐसे। हाँ फिर से ग म प सा नि ध प म ग रे सा। हाँ ग शुद्ध रहना चाहिए। ग म प सा नि ध प म ग रे सा। नि सा नि ध म म प ध ग म प सा नि ध प नि ध प म ग रे सा नि सा नि ध म म प ध ग म प सा नि ध। एक बार लगाओ। हाँ नि सा नि ध म म प ध ग म।
In the examples of teaching and learning how to play musical instruments that we just saw, a question that arises is exactly what is being learned and taught? Is the effectiveness of the teaching in such situations determined more by the level of skills of the pupil or the learner, or is it more a skill on the part of the teacher? Exactly what skills and what learning process is involved? Is it still just a case of imitative learning or observational learning, or is it a higher level of learning. We take these questions further to a different domain of teaching and learning, namely an academic one. We now watch a teacher teaching a young student something that is related very closely to classroom learning and teaching.
So, I will teach you about multiplication. So, multiplication is the short way of finding the sum when all addends are same. So, we are not required to add the same thing two times, 3 times, 4 times, we just multiplicate it. So, if we have to add 2, just like here, if we add 2 5 times, then 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. So, it will be same as 2 multiplied by 5. If we add 2 5 times, then 2 multiplied by 5 will give the same result when we add 2 5 times. So, it will be how much? 2 5s are 10, correct. So, now we do the some multiplication of 2 digits. So, if we have to multiply 27 by 24. So, we use this method 4 7s are 28, 4 2s are 8, 8 plus 2 10. Now, put cross here or 0, 2 7s are 14, 1 carry over, 2 2s are 4, 4 plus 1 5. Then we add these two lines, 8 plus 0 is equal to 8, 4 plus 0 is equal to 4 and 5 plus 1 is equal to 6. So, you have to multiply like this. Now, I am giving you a question. Just multiply 48 by 26. Show me how you multiply this.
6 8s are 48.
Yes.
8 and 4 carry over.
Okay.
6 4s are 24. 24 plus 4 is equal to 28. Then
28, right? 28. Yes, correct.
Then put cross. 8 2 8s are 16. 6 and 1 carry. Then 2 4s are 8. Now add 8. 8 plus 0 is equal to 8. 8 plus 6 is equal to
8 plus 6 is 14.
14.
Yes.
4 and 1 carry. 2 plus 1 is equal to 3 and 8 plus 3 is equal to 11.
Now, here you didn't add the carryover. Where 2 8s are 16, 1 carryover and 2 4s are 8. But here we should add 8 plus 1. So, this should be 9. Instead of 8, this should be 9. Okay. You remember it, you have to add whatever carryover is there. Okay. So, this the answer will be 2 plus 3, 9 plus 3
equal to 12.
12. So, this is the correct answer. Okay.
We are witnessing an example of learning which very clearly shows that this is a case of cognitive learning at some level. Now, there is another question that comes into the picture. The kind of task that is being taught to the child has to be commensurate with the cognitive developmental level of this child. Is the technique of teaching in accordance both with the cognitive developmental level and the skill or the actual task that has to be learned? These are questions that may have varied answers, but they are all important in the practical world of learning and teaching.
8 is equal to 53.
53, correct.
Then
53, right? 53, not 55. You should be careful in mathematics, okay?
After having looked at so many different theories and views of the learning process, including stimulus response theories, cognitive theories, social learning and social cognitive theories, and finally a constructivist views, it is time now to make a concluding comment on whatever has been seen in the past lectures. Here are some pointers that need to be highlighted. First of all, there are various theories of learning, and most of these theories focus on the learning process. A difference has been pointed out between SR, that is stimulus response, and cognitive theories. Both kinds of theories, of course, have their value. Secondly, a modification in approach has been suggested quite loudly, taking culture and the social context into account, something that was really left at the periphery in the earlier learning theories. There is, on this count, a difference between A, social learning and social cognitive theories, which do point attention to the social component, but tend to take a micro approach. And secondly, the social development and constructivist approach, which tends to take a broader, global or macro approach. Next, there could be several contexts of learning, and it is important to see what is being learned. To give an example, one might learn to play a musical instrument, or learn mathematics, or learn a specific task called mirror star tracing, that is, tracing a star pattern by looking at its reflection in a mirror. As one can see, each of these learning contexts involves complex skills going beyond more than just sets of responses or the learning of basic concepts that can be applied in given situations. Finally, attention is paid to the role of learning theories in education by way of the teaching process, instruction methods, curriculum, participative and collaborative aspects. All of these take into account information regarding cognitive, developmental and cultural aspects. This brings us to the end of our discussion of the learning process as psychologists describe it. We hope you have now got a very good idea of what learning is, not just according to psychologists, but in a slightly more extended way. Thank you.